Suffering is an invention. It's a thought, it's a construct, it's the way that there's a sense of reference in this external reality. It's an apparatus's attempt to intervene and interfere with something that needs no help. And if we start to look at our aspects of suffering or our struggle or the difficulties in this way, it can be an interesting inquiry altogether. Is this invented? Is this being created here and now? Is this being imposed? Is there an effort to force this experience into this particular mold? As we begin to age from childhood, we start to create these beliefs, and the nature of a belief is that which wants to remain as a permanent experience through thought, through those particular constructs. And if we can allow ourselves to let go of the belief, ironically, there is a dismantling of identity in the process. It's these conglomerations. It's like molecules, atoms to molecules and molecules to what seems to be objects. We see this fractalization, as is above, so is below, over and over and over, and the signature remains the same. So we have these thoughts, we have these experiences, and then they coalesce into some sort of belief, and then from there, that coalesces into some sort of identity. The beliefs that we tend to hold on to are basically the things that say something along these lines. This is just who I am. This is what I believe. This is my conviction. A sense of isolation from the rest of existence. And so to look at suffering as an invention, we can start to essentially dismantle some of these things. And as mentioned before, this is the building of the bridge to the unknown. This is the utilization of some of these intellectual processes to deconstruct, because it becomes really interesting to see that a lot of these particular mechanisms as they function lack a significant amount of even rationale or logic. Words like should and shouldn't and even acceptance, these concepts stop making sense altogether. It becomes kind of funny. This is the essence of the cosmic joke, that there's just an assumption and a going with, and that automatic identification with that particular experience eventually leads us into some sort of isolated covering and some sort of container of experience. Of course, this goes beyond experience. This goes beyond an experiencer, yet if we can just inquire a little bit into our day-to-day existence, in the way of asking, is this an invention? Is this being invented? Is the world really a challenging place? Is this job a crappy job? Is this relationship falling apart? These still are assumptions predicated on thoughts, of course. Yet sometimes it can be useful to look at the entire construct and just see if we can allow that to fall apart. Really, we don't even have to dismantle it. We don't have to take it apart. It's already doing that on its own. And to really make this simplistic and using a metaphor to anthropomorphize it, all of these constructs, all identity, all thought wants to return to emptiness. It's already falling apart. The effort it takes to hold up the house of cards can be significant. We can start with this. You don't have to invent suffering. You don't have to hold on to these constructs. And there can be some really worthwhile explorations in this way, some more general inquiry. Looking at the entire thing, we can start to at least piecemeal some of these chunks apart. And from there, it's like an iceberg, or if you live in a colder climate, when you break ice away from a larger body of ice, it's more likely to melt. Where am I inventing suffering? And even in the moment, it will be a lot more valuable to be in the immediacy of a moment, to look at the relationship that we have with other people, with our job, with ourselves. Simply asking, is this true? Is this an invention? And then we can even go a little further if you want to get a little broader here. And we can look at, what am I gaining by holding on to this? What am I gaining by reaffirming it? What am I gaining by resubscribing to these thoughts and beliefs? It's interesting that sometimes a sense of pain or discomfort can become an addictive experience. There's like a payoff, and that payoff seems to be some sense of a completion of a cycle or some sense of satisfaction that arises. If there's an underlying belief that I'm not good enough, something's wrong with me, I'm not lovable, to reaffirm that belief can actually give us a sense of completion. Sometimes we like to listen to sad songs. Sometimes we like to experience painful experiences because it tends to complete a cycle for us. It tends to close the loop and start us from the beginning. So from here, just adding that little simple inquiry, where am I inventing suffering? Is this an invention? Could be something as simple as the weather. That one seems to be pretty intense for some people, especially if you live in a colder climate or if you live in a rainy climate. There's this wearing down that can tend to happen. And really objectively looking at everything as objectively as possible. It's interesting to essentially enter into this particular conundrum, or what seems like a contradiction. We move into objectivity to start looking at these aspects of our lives and don't allow ourselves to enter into a reactive space, which can look like we are stepping away from what we feel to some degree. But instead, what we're doing, at least in a methodical inquiry-related approach, we begin to look at, is the weather something that can be changed? Just a simple dialogue along those lines. No. Is the weather so bad? No, it doesn't seem like it is. It's just raining or it's just snowing. Are there aspects about this that are enjoyable? And just to be as objective as possible can be useful, because it's when these things begin to feel so personal for us that is essentially being used as a point of leverage for the belief and for the invention of this suffering. The weather isn't personal. To really play with that in some sort of deconstructed way, we will begin to break it down from what seems to be material into the molecular form, into the atomic form, and so on. We begin to get into essentially the quantum level of the experience. And yes, while most of the pointings here are definitely pointing towards sensation, this is almost a two-pronged approach. It's this external to internal and this internal to external approach. It doesn't mean we have to rely on anything externally, yet we can look at what seems to be floating around us, what seems to be obvious, even in the thought space, and if we begin to entertain that in an objective way, even those particular thoughts cannot hold true. They don't hold water. They lose their integrity. They break apart. How objective can we be? Same thing with interactions with people. Let's say you have a difficult interaction. To be as objective as possible. What you might find is there's miscommunication, or that person is reacting from a protected space, and just to even see it that way, even intellectually to see it, and to inquire around that, and to even ask it, are they inventing suffering? And am I taking part? Am I being enrolled into that invention? We can start to see that that particular relationship doesn't have to be that way. we can get to the objective factors, and to really approach things objectively, it gets interesting. It becomes to the point where if things are personal for people, even an objective approach can seem personal. It can feel too blunt. Yet, if we look at things in a more objective manner, we begin to see that really we have to almost impart some sort of meaning or personal connection to an experience that just doesn't have that intrinsically, and that begins to give us some insight. To take all this so personally, and really, that's what being highly protected looks like. That's what existing in a defensive way really looks like, is that we take all of these things so intensely personally. Things that really have nothing to do with us. So to even play a thought game with that particular invention, to see if it holds true, to play the role of a scientist, the wind blowing outside, just here and there, these little gentle gusts. Does that have any meaning? Does it make us feel a certain way? Does that feel personal? Because in reality, it just is. It doesn't have any connection. It doesn't have any connection at all to a person. So that has to be interpreted, it has to be assumed, and then it has to be taken on in a specific way, and then almost like applied to a sensational experience. That's what seems to be happening here. It's basically like a sticker. Something's happening, and here's a sensation, stick it. To see it that directly, we begin to have a little bit more insight. And back to that two-pronged aspect, that internal to external, the external to internal, when we see the identity for what it is, we see nothing there. It is part of this. Inquiry can have a significant amount of value, and for some of us, inquiry right now is perfect. And also on a more direct level, a level that feels more personal, that's where the sensations come in. And initially, it seems like, and this probably doesn't apply 100% because that's really not the way any of this works, yet the identity itself seems to predicate so much off of using sensations as a reification of a belief. If there's a sensation that can be deemed as negative, then that can basically reinforce a certain type of belief. If there's a sensation that seems positive, that also can be used as a reinforcement of a belief. So to be able to recognize that that is happening in progress, or that's happening in the moment, can be extremely useful. To break down the invention itself, it's basically like getting the patent of this invention or the blueprints, and we're able to see all the pieces in a more intricate way. It's interesting how that functions. Yet to basically not allow ourselves to enter into a reactive emotional state and look at all of these particular outer experiences in a more objective way, it begins to actually take us closer to the sensations sometimes. That's the nature of this paradox, is that we don't have boundaries, we do have boundaries, we don't have boundaries. These things ebb and flow, and it's because really there is no separation between the two. It seems to be happening simultaneously, and we recognize an appearance, and then it changes and shifts. Really what we're looking to do is be right at the center of this paradox instead of valuing all these experiences in a singular-sided way. So I know this is just kind of a wide subject here, yet the invention of suffering itself can be really crucial to look at how often that is an imposed experience, and it seems to be the best way to approach that is to allow ourselves to get as objective as possible. Is this person having a bad day? Does it mean anything about me? Is the weather just the weather? Does it have any personal reference at all? Does it matter what is desired or not? Is it so bad? Are there aspects that I enjoy? These types of inquiry, these types of questions, which I know are moving a little bit more into identity, yet for some of us this might be useful. For those of us who may be a little bit closer to sensation, we continue the path toward immediacy. But in the reference of the broads and the narrows, this is part of the broad strokes of these things. Is it so personal? Things don't go the way we want them. Is that a personal experience? For a lot of people, they go, oh, why is this happening to me, right? Like as if there's some kind of doom being enacted, or we're being smitten in some way. That's really not the case. If we slow down enough to get objective about it, what we start to see is that our particular purview is being tuned based on a belief that good things don't happen to me, and we begin to essentially look for the ways that things aren't working. And in that particular belief or that confirmation bias, we're actually rejecting the things that don't apply. That's interesting. It's like looking at the world in a tunnel like this all the time, having this hyper focus right here and missing all the rest of it. This is the benefit of playing with the periphery on every single possible level, the visual field, audio field, sensational field, but also the periphery of the thoughts, periphery of the experience. Is it just happening like this here? Is here the only place this is happening? These kinds of things in terms of suffering has to be imposed. It has to be a thought. There's no way around it. So maybe moving forward, just if you're in this place where you're still kind of playing with inquiry and you notice, see if you can give yourself a little bit of a cue in the midst of something that's uncomfortable externally, something that seems like a challenge. See if you can ask yourself if you're inventing the suffering. Is this being invented? Is this personal? Is this about me? So on. And that will give us a little bit more insight on what's holding all of that together. And who knows, maybe along the way, you'll start to see some of those mechanisms break off from the larger mass of ice, and they begin to melt, dissolve, evaporate, so on. And as always, questions and comments are very welcome, and I appreciate you watching. Thank you.